All right, so finishing out the graphs in section 2.1, this is where we left off, which was with the frequency histogram, a bar chart using midpoints and then plotting the frequency as a bar above that midpoint. The second type of graph you're going to be looking at here in section 2.1 is called a frequency polygon. And so a few things to note about it. Number one, the setup is very similar to the histogram in that you are going to be using midpoints to label your classes on the horizontal axis, and then setting a scale defined by your frequencies on the vertical axis. The main difference is instead of drawing a bar over each midpoint, you're just going to plot a point to mark the frequency because the polygon is a line graph rather than a bar chart. All right, so what I want you to note here is I went ahead and did the initial setup for constructing the frequency polygon to show you that for the most part it's just the same thing as what we did for setting up the frequency histogram. I've got my midpoints on the horizontal axis, I've got my frequencies on the vertical axis. You will notice though that I've included a couple of extra points on the horizontal axis, kind of an additional start and end, and this is simply because the frequency polygon must always start at frequency 0 and end at frequency 0. All right, that means I need to start with a point on the horizontal axis and end with a point on the horizontal axis. Now, in order to do that, what we're going to do is maintain our class width, right, which we know is 7. And so to get our starting point here, all we're going to do is take the first midpoint and move back one class width. All right, that would tell me to start my scale here at 31, which will have no values, frequency 0. And then on the other end, we're just going to take that last midpoint of 73, and again, maintain the width of 7, but move out in the other direction, and that would tell me to end with a value of 80, which again has no value, so it will have frequency 0. All right, that is the main difference in how you set up graphing for your polygon versus your histogram. So all I'm going to do from here, I'm going to plot a point to mark the frequency. So at 38, I have frequency 12 instead of a bar. I'm just going to come up here and draw a point. At 45, I have frequency of 11. So I'm going to come down here. At 52, I have a frequency of 4. And then my last 3 midpoints are down here with a frequency of 1. All I've got left to do is connect my dots, right, to end up with a line graph, keeping in mind that I am starting from the horizontal axis, frequency 0. All right, then I'm going to go through each one, look at changes in frequency. And then on the other end, I'm going to bring this back down to 0. All right, so again, very similar to the histogram, but it is a line graph instead of a bar chart. And it has this important characteristic where you have to make sure you begin at frequency 0 and end at frequency 0. And you do this by just moving out from the first midpoint and the last midpoint by whatever your width is so that you maintain that fixed scale. All right, now lastly, the Ogive is a graph that looks at cumulative frequencies. So when you set this one up, you'll notice you're going to be graphing not the raw frequencies, but the cumulative frequencies. And because you're looking at cumulative frequencies here, this is a graph that will not use the midpoints. All right, this is a graph that's going to use class boundaries. So I want to refer back for just a minute early on in your notes. All right, we talked about the different terms that you were going to be seeing here. And the boundaries we kind of skipped over last class because we didn't need them. So what boundaries are going to do, you know limits cannot overlap. And so that's not good for graphing. It causes spaces in the graph. So boundaries, what we're going to do is kind of pull out those limits to where there is overlap, where, you know, where one ends, the next one picks up right there. It's very simple. All you're going to do to get your boundaries is take any lower limit and pull it back by half the space in between, and then take any upper limit and add 0.5. This will make a meet in the middle, maintaining the width and the frequencies and all of that, and it will be used solely for graphing the ogive. All right, so when I went to set this up, again, for our speeds, the values that I'm using on this horizontal axis are not the limits, right, which I went and pulled those limits back for you. They are actually the boundaries for the classes. So notice if I want to convert these to boundaries for all the lower limits, I'm just going to pull them back by 0.5. And for all the upper limits, I'm going to add 0.5 to pull them out in the other direction. And what you should be noticing as I'm doing this is that with the boundaries, where one class ends, the next class picks up right there. There's now no spaces in between. So again, those are the values that you're seeing here that I've used to plot my classes on the horizontal axis, right? Not repeating them, right? But just using each individual different boundary. Now, like the polygon, the ogive will start at frequency 0. So that very first lower boundary that you're plotting there will always be on the horizontal axis. But for everything else, what you're going to do is at the upper boundary, you're going to plot the cumulative frequency. So at 41.5, I'm going to come up here and plot a point at the cumulative frequency, which is 12. All right, again, upper boundary, cumulative frequency. So for class 2, upper boundary is 48.5, and I'm going to plot the cumulative frequency at 23. Continuing 55.5 is going to be at 27. And then I'm going to have to do a little approximating here. The main thing is to make sure your ogive should always be increasing. So I want to make sure, even though these are just going up ever so slightly, 62.5 should go up just a little bit to 28. 69.5, a little bit more to 29. And 76.5 should finish at the sample size, the number of values, which of course is 30. So this is going to be a line graph like the polygon, but because it graphs cumulative frequencies, it should always be increasing, and it should never come back down on the other end. It should always finish with the last cumulative frequency, as that shows you the sample size or the total number of values in the data set.